This is History on Drugs. Today I was going to drop my episode on the Mayan civilization because, let's face it, they really are the true rock stars of a drug culture. But in my research and as I went to present today, it just hit me. I mean, it didn't just hit me, but it's something I'm going to pontificate a little bit. Not quite a high horse, but certainly an emotional conversation about why don't historians and archaeologists and researchers and academics present history from the perspective of drugs? What makes them just overshoot it, bypass it, consider it non-important, easily dismiss it in most cases? Because they're not cool kids? Is that a theory? Maybe. And I don't mean that in a pompous way. I mean it that if you're looking at something through an academic lens versus a lens with different types of experience, it doesn't mean I'm not a junkie. That's not what I'm saying. But experience with drugs, right? Knowing how they can destroy lives, impact lives, or expand creativity. But the power of drugs in ancient civilizations, I think, is a lot more prevalent than we are taught. And the Mayans just confirmed this. But even in recent history, it's unacceptable that we've learned about World War II our entire lives. But until recently, historians and researchers and academics started talking about, the Nazis were on crystal meth. Yes, they were. And not just a couple of them. It essentially controlled the way they were able to be crazy and march into battle and kill people. Not just pilots like the American pilots taking speed so they could stay awake on long missions. These guys were using meth to be crazy and intimidating and not eating, right? And going into deranged mental scenarios and slaughtering people. But we never learned about it. Why? The evidence has been there. And there was a great book that came out, Norman Kohler maybe. He really exposed this. And I've heard historians literally mock his work, that he's like glamorizing drugs. No, he is not. But from his own personal beliefs and experiences, he's somebody that can look at the world through a lens of drug use, knowing what it can do and the way societies and people think about drugs. So if it's from a purely academic standpoint, with nerd glasses and dismissing the drugs because it's not romantic, it's failing future generations to learn properly. The Nazis used crystal meth. It was absolutely critical to their success in the early campaigns of the war. There's no question. You can have march for days without eating. You can't move an army through France at the speed they did, or, the blitzkrieg strategies of fast war. Think about it. And that's just one example. Why do we not learn that the Civil War truly created a significant opiate epidemic in America? We never learned that, not once. And I'm a Civil War buff, right? But until recently, it's not talked about in a serious way, when it literally shaped our culture after the war. Because we say tens of thousands, probably closer to hundreds of thousands of soldiers got addicted because just think of all the injuries in the war and the accessibility of morphine and opium and how it's distributed without knowing the long-term effects, which is stupid because Galen in the Roman Empire already wrote about the long-term effects. The ancient Egyptians, basically through glyphs and papyruses, sort of highlighted the effects and the addiction possibility. So why didn't we learn about the Civil War opiate epidemic? Why can drug companies and Congress people, in the last 5-10 years, literally say, oh, we didn't see this coming, this opiate epidemic? Of course we did. And if we learned about history properly through the lens of how substances had a huge impact, we might not have been in the problem in America that we have with the current opiate epidemic. Because, I mean, in the early 1800s, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was the one of the head doctors during the Revolutionary War, doling out opium, wrote a book about how dangerous it was. Thomas de Quincey. People have been warning for centuries that opiates are addicting, and it's just been ignored. And this made me think, and why the Mayans kind of inspired it, was historians neglecting the recreational, horrible word, but the regular person's use of the substances accessible in their time. Because if they researched it and documented it and presented it properly over centuries, we could easily have avoided the modern opiate epidemic. Now, David Courtwright did awesome research. He wrote about the Civil War opiate epidemic, right? And he's written about how drugs have shaped modern man and history for hundreds of years. Empires were built on drugs. Think of the tobacco trade or rum or whiskey trade or the opium trade. The opium trade has been so significant since it came out of Mesopotamia or parts of Europe or into Egypt or into the Far East on the Silk Road. And then on ships from the East India Company, right? It's been used and exploited, but never presented properly. Now, somebody did a good job talking about the dangers of opium by literally labeling the wars in China the opium wars. And this is when Britain literally exploited the addiction and suffering of Chinese people by forcing them to buy more opium and forcing opium trade on a society that was already struggling with its uses. And this was in the 1800s. So if history was presented properly, we could avoid so many future problems. So let's not deny future scholars, kids, educators, hobbyists, researchers from the fact that drugs not only impact cultures, that they shaped cultures. And I will argue in the Mayan civilization, much like other Mesoamerica ancient civilizations, that their use of psychedelics and hallucinogenics literally helped create these wild depictions that we see today. The Nazca people, right? I mean, they drew lines in the ground that you can only see from outer space. No, it's not aliens. And they likely went out to the desert and walked these lines in a psychedelic ceremony because they were trading for the San Pedro cactus, which is mescaline. It's hallucinogenic. You trip out for 10 to 12 hours. And when you're tripping, you're being guided, directed by a shaman. And we know the power of that because just look what Charles Manson has done to his little followers with LSD, right? They went and killed people because they believed it, because he was their shaman and he was driving them, corrupting their perception and their doors of perception in their mind and altering their consciousness of reality so that they thought killing people was actually correct. And that was all drugs. So that example, as dirty and dark as it is, just shows you that someone with great power, and this was just a crazy guy with a guitar, someone with great power, think about an ancient shaman in Mesoamerica, or a king. If they have that great power, and we know that they have access and are using hallucinogenics and psychedelics and other botanicals with psychoactive properties, think of how they could have driven minds. Think of how they could have shaped thoughts to negative creativity, positive creativity. And we see it in the artwork displayed on their pottery or in glyphs around the world that we discover. I mean, these guys the Mayans were just so out there that they loved pleasure. They created a game, for Christ's sakes, a ball game. A ball game is only created by society that enjoys pleasure, because most other struggling societies don't sit around and be like, hey, let's go play a game. No, they're worried about, how do we survive? So they had time, and they were a pleasure-seeking society that they created a game. But within that game, they actually killed people and sacrificed people. Why? Because they had 8 different botanicals that we know of that got them high. So to say they only use them in a medicinal or ceremonial way is bullshit. If it's accessible and people know the power of it, they're going to use it. So historians often dismiss this or control the narrative. Why? I mean, the nerd theory is just not a thing. Nerds are cool these days, but you know what I mean? It's like, why so stale, if you will? I'm not trying to glamorize the use of drugs, but man, the Mayans taught us that they would get high off everything they could find. I listened to a historian the other day who was doing a PowerPoint presentation, literally trying to argue that the Mayans did not use the mushrooms that they depicted in their drawings, that they had coming out of the heads of different weird animals. No, they didn't use it. There's no evidence that they used it. Of course they did. If they're using these 8 other plants that we can prove they used, why the hell aren't they using that one? Of course they are. If they licked one toad, why did they lick 50 toads to get high? And all these cultures are using hemp. You think when you're looking at a plant with sticky, fat, crunchy buds, you're like, nah, let's just make clothes and rope out of it. No, they were smoking the shit out of it, and it gets dismissed by historians because nobody wrote down like, hey, we were doing bong hits after the Battle of Gettysburg. Nobody wrote about it. Oh, but of course they were. Because if you're experimenting with one botanical, of course you're going to experiment with others, whether it was thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, or things we're finding in the rainforest and jungle today. There's like new drugs I learn about all the time. So I guess that this rant is essentially not anger directed at or to. It's more of, let's expand the way we approach our learning of history, not to glamorize the drugs, but to ask, how did drugs really have an impact on a civilization, a people, a culture, or an event? And I named a few, right? The opiate epidemic after the Civil War. These soldiers, they didn't know what they were doing. They couldn't get off that shit. A true story is one of the guys addicted to morphine used cocaine to invent a drink, which later became Coca-Cola, thinking it could get him off opium. So that is evidence of a confused society with a inability, or not an inability, with a limited knowledge of medical science, or else you wouldn't use cocaine to get off opium. But it just shows the desire, the need, the thirst, the possibility, the accessibility of using drugs for things. Okay, and if they made you feel good, there is a debatable line in some Magellan's writing in the Roman Empire that there was prevalent opium use and that it couldn't function without it. Some of the soldiers. Of course you can't, because they're addicted to it. In Diseases of the Mind, Dr. Benjamin Rush wrote a couple decades after the Revolutionary War how bad opium was, and it turned people crazy. Yet he was participating in the doling out of opium to Revolutionary War soldiers before they had their legs cut off or when they were injured in battle, because he helped produce, he was like a Surgeon General of the middle area of the Revolutionary War around Philadelphia. And literally in some of the documents he produced, it was like, this is the dose, right? 2 to 4 doses an hour of opium. If you take 2 to 4 doses an hour of opium for a week, guess what? You ain't getting off that opium, bro. You're going to be looking for more. And we don't know because it's not documented. We can't go into a old rehab file cabinet and be like, oh yeah, here's all their evidence of the counseling they attended. No, it didn't exist like it does today. So we got to expand our thoughts beyond the plain and stale and the simple to say, how did drugs influence this? Did drugs have an influence on these mind games, on creating a ball game, on cutting their penis to drip blood so they lose oxygen and get high? But why would they cut their penis? Whose idea was that? Obviously somebody without impulse control, probably the same dude that was like, oh, this crazy creature in the sky that flies and we see him as a god, right? Well, how'd you come up with that? I was high on peyote, or I was high on a tree bark. How do you figure out to boil a tree bark to get fucked up with, right? Well, why only try that tree bark? If that tree bark works, are you trying other tree barks? Of course you are. So we got to stop dismissing weed throughout history. Of course they used it. Besides making rope. I just watched some research and was reading some that was so, oh, we have no evidence of this. We have no evidence of that. We have plenty of evidence that drugs existed for thousands of years. Cavemen, right? Men in the Neolithic period are the ones that created, cultivated, domesticated the opium poppy. We did it. It wasn't just a plant from God. There was like, some plants we found, which made them stronger. Why do we make them stronger? Because of that inner desire and consciousness, because of its pleasure. It feels good. And then we can relate that to ceremonies and to control people and to get you to expand your thoughts, or just because you're hurting or the baby's crying, whatever it is. So the more I uncover periods of history from the angle I present this show at for fun, I'm like, wow, of course they got high. Of course the people of the village used the same drugs the shaman used. Why wouldn't they? They have problems. They're not the same problems we have. But if you could drink chicha in Southwest Peru, 2,000 years ago, it's an alcoholic drink with other stuff in it that gets you effed up. Why aren't you going to drink it after you have a fight with your husband or your kid, or you stubbed your foot, or somebody died and you're sad? Of course you are. And then you know what it feels like. You tell your friend, they know what it feels like. Of course, things are used of purpose outside medicinal and ceremonial. So when drugs are prevalent in a society, they are being used beyond the scope of the evidence we have, which is always going to be medical or spiritual, because these are the artifacts we found. And this was a debate I had with someone about opium, about how cavemen domesticated the opium poppy, maybe from the horny poppy or another one. Debate whether it was in the Switzerland area or in the Spain area. The climates were much different, 5,000 BC. Either way, it was cultivated by man. And we learned that because of the seeds found on human remains that were found. So if we're only finding limited evidence of an ancient or a Neolithic culture or people, we're just finding a little teeny bit of evidence. But in it is a drug. Well, that statistically should be a sign that drug's a lot more important than just this dude's problem, because we found it in multiple spots. And we've only found 10 things, and 2 of them are related to drugs. It is prevalent in that culture. And if there's no evidence that that person's a doctor or a king, it's likely used for whatever they want it for, which would classify it as recreational. So every event in history that we start looking at from a perspective of drugs and the impact of drugs, we must ask the question, beyond this, who are the other people in the society using drugs, and why, and what impact might that have it had on the society as a whole? I think it's fascinating. I get emotional about it because I love this topic, but this conversation is based in the fact that we've just suffered an opiate crisis. And yet, for thousands of years, we've been warned that opium, are dangerous, man. I mean, look at coca, right? The ancient South American people been chewing coca leaves because of its stimulating properties. It could lower their appetite so they could not have to carry so much food when they're out there farming or trading or whatever it is they're doing. Why do they know that? They know it because that's what it does. So of course they're bringing it home. Their son's going to take it just like you used to steal booze from your parents, or your friend or your neighbor needs it. It's recreational use. So time to re-examine history, real history. That drugs had a much bigger impact on societies, helping to motivate the creativity of cultures. Like when we see stuff creative in societies, we don't have to jump to aliens. But if you could make an alien correlation, that's likely because drugs had an impact on that event or product or person or culture, that it did something so creative that you would have to expand your perception and the outer reaches of your mind to think of something like that. Nazca lines, for instance. I don't know, I'm just rambling, but I think it's something to think about. And again, I meant to say this more about David Courtwright's book. I'm not selling his book. This thing is like 4 years old. But he saw the importance of substances in all societies. He talks about how it just basically built empires. He talks how it moved around the world, right? When the East India Company had bigger, faster ships, they could just put more opium, more silver on it, more coca on it, more whiskey on it, more rum on it, more whatever, tobacco, more of everything on it, and move it to further parts of the world. So the use of drugs in environments where they are not local just got easier. and it brought them around the world. You know, it's why the San Pedro cactus ends up thousands of miles away in Peru. Probably not thousands. Bad map work there, but hundreds of miles away. So anyways, this has been a rant by me on History on Drugs.